July 11th, 2006. Snohomish County, Washington. 56-year-old Mary Cooper and her 27-year-old daughter, Susanna Stodden, leave their homes in Seattle in order to go hiking on the Pinnacle Lake Trail. Later that day, Mary and Susanna's bodies are found alongside the trail after they have both been shot in the head, and even though some of their clothing was removed, they were not sexually assaulted. For years, Mary's husband is looked at as a potential suspect before he's officially ruled out, but even though a partial male DNA profile is found under Susanna's fingernails, it has not been matched to anyone, and the Pinnacle Lake murders remain unsolved. After that, the trail went cold. Hello everyone, and welcome to our latest episode of The Trail Went Cold. I'm your host Robin Warder, and this week we're going to be covering a double homicide involving a mother and daughter, the 2006 murders of Mary Cooper and Susanna Stodden, aka the Pinnacle Lake Murders. Over the years, I've received a number of requests to cover this case, and I can understand why, as it's a major head-scratcher and a crime which literally took place on a trail. Mary and Susanna both lived in Seattle and decided to make a 60-mile trip to Snohomish County in order to hike the Pinnacle Lake Trail, but after nearly reaching the end of the trail, they crossed paths with someone who fatally shot them both in the head. There were no signs of robbery, and even though neither victim was sexually assaulted, some of their clothing was removed, suggesting that someone did make an attempt to attack them before things escalated into murder. But while there were other hikers on the trail that day, no one reported seeing or hearing anything unusual until the bodies were discovered. For years, the Snohomish County Sheriff's Office put a lot of focus on Mary's husband and Susanna's father, David Stodden, even though he seemed to have a rock-solid alibi that day and no apparent motive to do this. Since it took over a decade to formally clear him as a suspect, investigators have received criticisms about tunnel vision, but new forensic testing has recently turned up a partial male DNA profile underneath Susanna's fingernails, and while it has not yet been matched to anyone, there's a decent chance that it belongs to the killer. But unfortunately, we're closing in on the 20-year anniversary of this crime, and investigators have still not turned up a solid suspect or much insight into why this horrific murder was committed in the first place. Anyway, when I'm done discussing the Pinnacle Lake murders, I'm going to take a few moments to talk about another case involving the double homicide of a mother and daughter from the Seattle area. The victims in this case are a 25-year-old single mother named Patricia Dixon and her 5-year-old daughter Amanda, who left on what they believed would be a dream vacation to Disneyland in Anaheim, California, before they were both inexplicably shot to death inside their motel room. Once again, the identity of the killer and their motive is still a big mystery, but since there has been a disappointing lack of coverage and available information about the Dixon case, I'm going to spend some time discussing it once I'm done talking about the Pinnacle Lake murders. However, before we get started, just a quick reminder that The Trail Went Cold is a weekly podcast, which is currently available for download on several platforms, including Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, YouTube Music, Podcast Addict, and more. So if you like this podcast, be sure to subscribe to it, and please leave us a rating or review on any of those sites to help spread the word. The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so if you would like to learn how to support the show, please visit our page at patreon.com/thetrailwentcold. For as little as $1 a month, you can garner access to exclusive rewards, including stickers and thank you cards, early access to episodes, and bonus content, as our Patreon page now officially has 100 exclusive bonus episodes in our archives, which are not available on a regular feed. So with all that out of the way, let us now delve into the murders of Mary Cooper and Susanna Stodden. Our story begins in Washington State in 2006, and our two victims are 56-year-old Mary Cooper and her 27-year-old daughter, Susanna Stodden, who both live in Seattle. Mary originally hails from Springfield, Pennsylvania, and for the past 28 years, she's been married to her 57-year-old husband, David Stodden. The couple originally met while they were both art students at the University of Washington, and they now have 3 adult daughters, Susanna and her younger sisters, Elisa and Joanna. Mary earned a bachelor's degree in education and previously taught deaf students at View Ridge Elementary School during the 1970s, but after going back to school to earn a master's degree in library and information science, she is now employed as a librarian at Seattle's Alternative Elementary School No. 2, and even uses her skills with sign language to work with autistic students. As for Susanna, she graduated from Western Washington University in Bellingham with a degree in environmental science and spent some time working as an environmental educator with the National Audubon Society, a nonprofit environmental organization dedicated to the conservation of birds and their habitats. She also worked for the Nooksack Salmon Enhancement Association and spent a year doing volunteer work in Nepal and is about to start a teaching internship at the University Child Development School. Susanna lives in a rental house with a roommate and has been dating someone for a year and a half, and much like the rest of her family, she is passionate about hiking and the outdoors. On July the 11th, Mary and Susanna were planning to travel to Mount Pilchuck State Park, located in Snohomish County on the western edges of the Cascade Mountains. They would hike up the summit of Mount Pilchuck, and while Susanna invited her roommate to come along with them, she had to decline because she was too busy, a decision which may have wound up saving her life. Even though the temperature was 70 degrees that day, David Stodden reminded his wife and daughter that there was still the possibility of snow being on the trail and advised them to be careful, but Susanna assured him that she looked up the trail conditions online and confirmed they were clear. At 8 a.m., Mary left her residence in her Dodge Caravan and told David she would pick up Susanna and be home at around 4:30 p.m., but this would turn out to be the last time he ever saw her alive. David made his living as a contractor who built and remodeled houses, and he would spend the day working on a house in the Green Lake neighborhood before he returned home at 5:30. To his surprise, Mary was not there, but said he was not initially concerned, as he just figured that she was running a bit late. At the time, David was training for an upcoming 200-mile cycling trip from Seattle to Portland, Oregon, and had made arrangements to meet a friend in Seward Park so they could take a bike ride together. After they completed the ride, David had dinner at his friend's house before he returned to his own residence at 8:45. But once again, Mary had still not returned, so David tried calling both her and Susanna on their cell phones. His calls went straight to voicemail, so David called a number of different law enforcement agencies to report that his wife and daughter were missing and expressed his concern that they might have gotten hurt or lost on the Mount Pilchuck Trail. David was told that the authorities would perform a search for them, and he kept trying to call Mary and Susanna's cell phones, which once again went straight to voicemail. Finally, sometime after 10 p.m., David decided that he was going to drive to Mount Pilchuck State Park to perform his own search, but as he was climbing into his pickup truck, a pair of detectives from the Snohomish County Sheriff's Office suddenly showed up at his residence and shared the horrible news that Mary and Susanna had been found dead. At first, the detectives would not provide any specific details about how they died, but to David's surprise, they did tell him that Mary and Susanna's bodies had been found alongside the Pinnacle Lake Trail rather than the Mount Pilchuck Trail. It appeared that they had made a last-minute decision to change the destination for their hike, as the Pinnacle Lake Trail was located in Mount Baker Snoqualmie National Forest on the eastern slope of Mount Pilchuck, about 16 miles from Mount Pilchuck State Park. While David said he initially assumed that Mary and Susanna were the victims of a fatal animal attack or some sort of accidental death, he was soon shocked to learn that they had been murdered, as they were both fatally shot in the head. Very few specific details, such as how many times they were shot and the caliber of the weapon that was used, have been released to the public, though investigators have confirmed that shell casings were recovered from the scene. Their bodies were discovered alongside the Pinnacle Lake Trail by a couple who were hiking in the area, and since there was no cell phone service, they were forced to drive to a nearby campground and called 911 at around 2:30 p.m. Even though Mary and Susanna's bodies had been pulled a short distance off the trail, their bodies were not hidden and easily visible to anyone passing by. While both victims were partially undressed and some of their clothing had been removed, the autopsies would later reveal that neither of them were sexually assaulted. Both of their backpacks were found at the scene, and it did not appear that anything had been taken from them, and since they were still carrying their wallets and cell phones, robbery was not the apparent motive for the crime. Mary's Dodge Caravan was also still parked at the trailhead, nearly 2 miles from the crime scene, and it was estimated that Mary and Susanna would have needed to hike for at least 45 minutes before they wound up at the spot where their bodies were discovered. The crime left everyone completely perplexed, since Mary and Susanna were both known for being friendly, universally beloved people without any known enemies. The only two individuals who even knew that they were going on a hike that day were David, as well as Susanna's roommate, who were both under the impression that they would be hiking on the Mount Pilchuck Trail before they presumably changed their minds. It seemed unlikely that anyone could have followed Mary and Susanna to this location, which was over 60 miles northeast of Seattle. The route would have required them to travel north on Interstate 5 before they headed east and wound up in the town of Granite Falls. After driving another 20 miles east on Mountain Loop Highway, they would then get on Forest Service Road 4020, a winding gravel road, and travel 6 miles to the Pinnacle Lake Trailhead. At the time Mary and Susanna's bodies were discovered, 2 additional vehicles were parked at the trailhead, but investigators confirmed that they were able to track down and interview all these vehicles' drivers and passengers. A couple days after the murders took place, a poster under the username Witness left a comment on a local hiking discussion forum, nwhikers.net, claiming that he and his wife had interacted with Mary and Susanna in the hours before they were killed. He said that they showed up at the Pinnacle Lake Trailhead at around 10 a.m. and bumped into Mary and Susanna, who had also just arrived. He described both of them as being, quote-unquote, exceptionally nice, and had what he described as a, quote-unquote, pleasant conversation with them before he and his wife headed up the trail and last saw Mary and Susanna looking at a notice board. He expressed his regret for not waiting for them, as he wondered if the killer may have been more reluctant to target 4 people who were hiking together as a group. The witness said that over the course of the next 4 hours, he and his wife did not see or hear anything unusual, though he did recall hearing what sounded like thunder at one point, and in retrospect, he wondered if it might have been gunshots. After hiking beyond Pinnacle Lake, the witness and his wife started heading back down the trail during the mid-afternoon, but at around 2:20 p.m., they noticed Mary and Susanna's bodies. This prompted the couple to immediately hike to the trailhead at a very rapid pace, as they were terrified that the killer might still be in the area and would target them as well. The witness said he was planning to call 911, but the other couple who originally discovered the bodies had already done so, and it wasn't long before the authorities arrived at the scene. The poster confirmed that he had already shared this information with the Snohomish County Sheriff's Office, though at the time, they would not publicly comment on the veracity of his story. However, it has since come out that this witness's forum post was legitimate, and he really did interact with Mary and Susanna that day, and while neither he nor his wife were considered to be suspects, they are the last known people to have seen the victims alive. It turned out that the other vehicle which was parked at the trailhead when the police arrived belonged to a man who had been fishing with his 2 sons at Bear Lake. Since they hiked to the lake on a different trail, they never actually saw Mary and Susanna, but they did recall hearing what sounded like gunshots at around 1 p.m. Following the murders, Alternative Elementary School No. 2 put up a makeshift memorial for Mary, which consisted of a cardboard sign, 5 sunflowers, and this message, quote, "Mary in the library, the nicest person in the universe. You will always be in our hearts," end quote. The following year, the school library where she worked was named after her in her honor. A wooden memorial plaque for Mary and Susanna was also put up on a tree near the murder scene, and both victims were cremated and had their ashes spread at such locations as Mount Kilimanjaro and the Grand Canyon. It was initially recorded that if Mary and Susanna had been killed on federal forest land, the FBI would have been able to assist with the investigation, but that turned out not to be the case. The investigation was headed up by the Snohomish County Sheriff's Office, though they did ask the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit to to provide a criminal profile for the killer. At the outset, there was speculation that Mary and Susanna may have been killed because they stumbled upon something they weren't supposed to see, such as a drug deal. These rumors were likely fueled by the fact that the crime took place near Granite Falls, a town which was known for having serious issues during that time period with drugs such as methamphetamine, so much so that Rolling Stone magazine once published an article about the topic which nicknamed the town Methville. However, there was no evidence to support the theory that Mary and Susanna's murders were drug-related, and like I just mentioned, none of the other witnesses who hiked the trail that day reported seeing any suspicious characters or activity. A few weeks after the crime took place, the Snohomish County Sheriff's Office publicly announced that detectives had identified quote-unquote persons of interest in the crime, though they would not provide any further details. David Stodden was very proactive when it came to spreading awareness about his wife and daughter's murders, as he frequently paid visits to the spot on the Pinnacle Lake Trail where the crime took place and sought information by circulating flyers and posters throughout the area. David was very open about speaking to the media and initially expressed his confidence that investigators would soon solve the case, but in December of that year, the sheriff's office publicly announced that they were focusing on David as a potential suspect. In order to conclusively clear his name, David consented to a polygraph examination, even though his family, friends, and attorneys advised him against it. The test took place in January of 2007 and was administered by the FBI, but the results were inconclusive, which David possibly attributed to him having a cold that day. He agreed to take a second polygraph, but the results were once again inconclusive, and while investigators would not say that they considered David to be a suspect, he was not ruled out as one either. David would openly express his frustration about law enforcement's focus on him, as he seemed to have an airtight alibi placing him over 60 miles away from the location where the murders took place. Like I mentioned earlier, David was a contractor and claimed that he spent the entire day doing renovations on a house in Seattle's Green Lake neighborhood, and he also told the press that a fellow worker could corroborate his whereabouts. Later that day, when detectives showed up at David's residence to inform him about the deaths of his wife and daughter, one of the first things they did was search his pickup truck and checked his odometer and his gas gauge to see if there was any evidence that he had recently driven a great distance. David would spend the next several years continuing to do everything he could to spread awareness about the murders, which included posting constant ads in the Everett-based newspaper, the Daily Herald, in order to seek new tips and information. At one point, David offered a $20,000 reward, though he was only allowed to advertise it if it had an expiration date, which he listed as September of 2013. This reward did not lead to any major new developments, so when the expiration date passed, David announced that he was going to donate the money to the Washington Trails Association and the Seattle Public Library. The crime would also be featured on Washington State's first deck of cold case playing cards, which were distributed among inmates in jails and prisons in hopes that they might compel someone to come forward with new information, but unfortunately, this did not bring the case any closer to a resolution. There was also speculation that Mary and Susanna might have been murdered by notorious serial killer Israel Keyes, who had been living in Nia Bay, Washington at the time the crime took place, and died by suicide inside his jail cell in December of 2012. But 8 months after Keyes' death, the FBI publicly announced that based on their investigation into his movements, they did not consider Keyes to be a suspect in the Pinnacle Lake murders. In October of 2018, Snohomish County Sheriff's detectives informed David that they would not do any further investigation into the case until he agreed to submit to a third polygraph exam so they could formally rule him out. Even though David was left frustrated by this, he reluctantly agreed to the request, and this time he wound up passing, and a spokesperson for the sheriff's office finally made a public statement in which they confirmed that they no longer considered David to be a person of interest. The case wound up being reassigned to a cold case team, and due to advances in forensic science, a decision was made to perform new testing on some fingernail clippings which had been collected from both victims and preserved as evidence. While the original testing had not turned up anything of evidentiary value, This time around, they were able to extract a partial male DNA profile underneath Susanna's fingernails. The DNA did not match David or Susanna's boyfriend from that time period and is yet to be linked to anyone. Investigators have confirmed that due to forensic advances, they are planning to re-examine some items which were never tested, but after nearly 20 years, there are still no conclusive answers about who is responsible for the Pinnacle Lake murders. So I guess you could say the trail went cold. So this is one of the rare cases I've covered in which I can utter the phrase, the trail went cold in a literal sense, since it involved two victims being murdered on a trail. And here we are 2 decades later, and even though investigators have recently uncovered a very promising piece of forensic evidence, it sounds like they're no closer to figuring out the identity of the perpetrator and their motive than they were back in 2006. I know that victims in unsolved cold cases are always portrayed in the best possible light, as their loved ones will often say glowing things about them, but I can tell that these sentiments were genuine towards Mary Cooper and Susanna Stodden, who were described as being two of the nicest, kindest, and most optimistic people you'd ever want to meet, and unlikely candidates to be victims of a crime like this. And if you've seen interviews with David Stodden, he seems like a genuinely nice man as well, and it's hard to believe that law enforcement considered him to be a potential suspect for as long as they did. David is definitely one of the most proactive family members of a cold case victim I've ever seen, as he has never stopped seeking answers and attempting to spread awareness. If you search the newspaper archives for the Daily Herald, you'll see that for the past several years, David has posted dozens of large ads featuring a photograph of his wife and daughter, imploring people to come forward if they have information about their murders. It's safe to say that none of his actions fit the profile of a guilty man, but even though David was never formally named as a suspect by law enforcement, and it sounds like no one who personally knew him ever believed that he did this, I'm sure he still had to live under a cloud of suspicion for a while. David had no apparent motive and a very strong alibi, but it sounds like the Snohomish County Sheriff's Office did not want to officially rule him out until he passed a polygraph, and it took him 3 tries in order to do so. I can understand why investigators would need to cover all their bases in order to be certain that David was not the perpetrator, but I'm sure you all know that polygraphs are unreliable, so the results should be of secondary importance to whether or not David had the motive, means, and opportunity to commit this crime, which he apparently did not. The fact that they flat out told David that they wouldn't investigate the case any further until he consented to a 3rd polygraph really rubbed me the wrong way, and gives me the impression that they may have developed tunnel vision because they were unable to turn up any other promising leads. I certainly hope that focusing so much on David did not cause alternate leads to slip through their fingers, but the good news is that it sounds like the cold case team currently handling this investigation have finally moved past David, and I think the partial male DNA profile, which was found underneath Susanna's fingernails, is the best chance we now have to solve this thing. While the profile has yet to be matched to a suspect, I'm sure it has helped rule out a number of people, and yes, that includes Israel Keys. Even though the FBI never really believed that Mary and Susanna were Keys victims to begin with, it's been reported that the DNA does not match him. While we still don't know the perpetrator's identity, it seems doubtful that the 2 women were killed by someone they knew, because no one would have even been aware that they'd be on that particular trail on that particular day. The only 2 people who knew they would be hiking to begin with were David and Susanna's roommate, but they were both under the impression that they would visit the Mount Pilchuck Trail, and they seemingly made a last-minute decision to hike the Pinnacle Lake Trail instead without telling anyone. We still don't know why they did this, but even though it was the middle of July, there were safety concerns about snow being on the Mount Pilchuck Trail that day, so it's pretty ironic that they decided to go to a trail which turned out to be completely unsafe for entirely different reasons. Investigators find it very unlikely that someone from Seattle could have targeted Mary and Susanna and then followed them all the way to the Pinnacle Lake Trail, because the drive takes around 2 hours, with the last 6 miles of the route being on a winding 2-lane gravel road where it would be very difficult to tail someone without being detected. And as we're going to talk about momentarily, a witness posted about interacting with Mary and Susanna at the trailhead right after they arrived that morning, and he did not recall seeing anyone else there who could have been watching them. So the most logical explanation is that Mary and Susanna were just in the wrong place at the wrong time, and by a pure stroke of terrible luck, they just happened to cross paths with a killer on the trail. What's particularly frustrating is that even though there were a couple of other witnesses who hiked the trail that day, it does not appear that they saw any suspicious individuals who could have been the perpetrator. When the authorities first arrived at the scene after receiving the 911 call about the victims' bodies, they said there were 2 other vehicles parked at the trailhead and confirmed they were able to track down and question all of these vehicles' drivers and passengers, which means that the killer was likely long gone from the area. We know that one couple discovered Mary and Susanna's bodies while hiking back down the Pinnacle Lake Trail, but never interacted with them while they were alive. Another couple also hiked the trail that day, and like I just mentioned, they had a conversation with Mary and Susanna at the trailhead at around 10 a.m., and the husband wound up sharing his account of this in a hiking forum a few days later. He claimed that he and his wife headed up the trail before Mary and Susanna and did not see them again for over 4 hours when they headed back down the trail and eventually discovered their bodies. At one point, he also recalled hearing a noise which sounded like thunder, but in retrospect, this may have been the fatal gunshots. And there were 3 other witnesses who were fishing at Bear Lake that day and thought they heard gunshots at around 1 p.m. It's estimated that it would have taken Mary and Susanna at least 45 minutes to hike from the trailhead to the spot where their bodies were found, so if they were actually killed at 1 o'clock, it makes you wonder where they were and what they were doing during that nearly 3-hour window after they conversed with the married couple. We know that the call to 911 took place at 2:30, so the perpetrator had ample time to flee the scene before the police arrived. It's also been reported that a witness who was driving on Forest Service Road 4020 that afternoon did see what appeared to be a red pickup truck or SUV speeding past him, which he found unusual since it was unsafe to drive that fast on that particular road. He didn't see the driver or get a good enough look at the vehicle to provide much of a description, but for all we know, this could have been the killer fleeing the area. Now, in terms of motive, it does not sound like anything was stolen from the 2 victims, so robbery was ruled out. I know that investigators looked into the possibility that the crime may have been drug-related, and that Mary and Susanna stumbled across some sort of drug deal and were murdered for it, which is a popular theory I often see pushed forward for unsolved crimes that take place in rural areas. I suppose this theory isn't completely unreasonable, since there were issues with drugs in Snohomish County during that time period, which led to the nearby town of Granite Falls being nicknamed Methville. But if someone was dealing or manufacturing meth in the woods, I seriously doubt they would do so next to a public trail that was frequently traveled by visitors. Of course, I don't rule out the possibility that the killer may have been on drugs at the time and that influenced their decision to commit these murders, but if it was some desperate addict, I have a feeling they would have robbed the victims. It's also worth mentioning that Mary's Dodge Caravan was left untouched at the trailhead, as it did not appear that anyone made an attempt to break into it, so I definitely think this crime was committed for reasons that had nothing to do with monetary gain. The most logical theories which have been pushed forward is that this was either a random thrill kill or attempted sexual assault gone wrong. While Mary and Susanna were not actually assaulted, some of their pieces of clothing had been removed, which suggested that someone attempted to undress them or force them to undress at gunpoint until things escalated into murder, and the perpetrator never got the opportunity to rape them as he had planned. This may have been the result of the victims attempting to fight back, which is why a partial male DNA profile was found underneath Susanna's fingernails. This theory does make sense, but it still begs the question about whether this person was just lying in wait in the woods near the trail hoping to attack someone, or if the whole thing was a spontaneous, spur-of-the-moment decision. We know that 2 pairs of couples hiked the Pinnacle Lake Trail that day, but if the killer saw them, he may have decided to leave them alone because a man was present. However, when he saw that Mary and Susanna were walking together on their own, he then decided to attack them. It's pretty haunting to read that witness's forum post and hear him express his regret that he and his wife did not wait for Mary and Susanna, because if the four of them had headed up the trail together, perhaps the killer would have been more reluctant to attack them. But then again, this could have also led to the witness and his wife being killed as well, so until we find out the identity of the perpetrator, we may never know how these events played out. For all we know, perhaps this person was only planning to commit sexual assault and did not expect to kill anyone, but fired off his gun when the victims put up a fight. Investigators have released a limited amount of details about the crime scene, so I'm not sure if the details point towards this being a premeditated murder or a spontaneous, unplanned act of violence. During interviews, David Stodden has expressed his opinion that the person who did this has somehow managed to keep their mouth shut for 2 decades, which could explain why no one has come forward with information about their identity. The big stumbling block with unsolved homicides involving firearms is that the shooter often doesn't leave any DNA evidence behind, but even though the original forensic testing failed to turn up any DNA, things have advanced so much in recent years that they were able to extract a partial male profile from underneath Susanna's fingernails. I know investigators have expressed their hope that they can do genetic genealogy and link the profile to a suspect, but if there is a limited amount of DNA to work with, this sort of thing can sometimes be challenging, so it remains to be seen if it leads to an identification. I should add the caveat that the presence of a partial male DNA profile under Susanna's fingernail does not necessarily mean that it belonged to her killer, but if it can be matched to anyone, at least it will allow investigators to build a case against this person, because at the moment, they don't seem to have anyone on their radar. As it stands right now, this was a completely baffling and senseless crime in which 2 universally beloved women lost their lives, so here's hoping that the loved ones will finally receive justice. So if you happen to have any information about the murders of Mary Cooper and Susanna Stodden, please contact the Snohomish County Sheriff's Office at 425-388-3845. That's 425-388-3845. So now let's take a few moments to talk about another unsolved cold case involving a murdered mother and daughter. Our second story takes place in 1984 and involves another pair of victims from the Seattle area, 25-year-old Patricia Dixon and her 5-year-old daughter, Amanda Dixon. Patricia originally hails from Lexington, Kentucky, and graduated from high school in Knoxville, Tennessee, but relocated to Seattle after marrying her husband, Richard Dixon, since he was stationed there with the Coast Guard. Patricia and Richard soon had a daughter named Amanda before they got divorced, and he has since transferred to the other side of the country and is stationed in Boston, Massachusetts. Patricia and Amanda now reside together in the suburban city of Burien, just south of Seattle, and Patricia's mother and stepfather have since moved to the area in order to be closer to them. Patricia is employed as a secretary for the Fred Meyer Variety Company, a chain of shopping centers, and she has spent the last several months working a lot of overtime in order to save money for a dream vacation for herself and her daughter. Patricia has always wanted to take Amanda to Disneyland in Anaheim, California, and she has managed to purchase a travel package deal as part of a Seattle-based tour group. On Monday, March the 26th, Patricia and Amanda flew from Seattle to John Wayne Airport in Santa Ana and then rented a car to travel to the Anaheim Park Motor Inn, a 3-story, 112-room motel located only a quarter-mile north of Disneyland. Even though each member of the tour group traveled to Anaheim individually, they would all stay at this particular motel, and Patricia's plan is to spend the week there before she and Amanda fly back home on Friday, March the 30th. Well, Patricia and Amanda arrived at the Anaheim Park Motor Inn as planned on the 26th and checked into their first-floor poolside room, which was number 123. They then spent March the 27th at Disneyland before they returned to the motel during the later afternoon. Patricia and Amanda were last seen together at the motel pool at around 4 p.m., and Patricia was reportedly seen alone near the front counter at around 7 p.m., but sometime within the next several hours, they would both become the victims of an horrific crime. The following day, at around 1:30 p.m. on March the 28th, a maid entered room 123 in order to clean it, but was shocked to discover their bodies. Patricia's nearly nude body was found lying on her back in the corner of the room with her underwear pulled down to her knees, and a cigarette had been placed between her legs. She was shot 3 times in the head and twice in the back with a small caliber handgun. Amanda was shot twice in the head by the same murder weapon and was lying face down under the covers of her bed. She was dressed in her pajamas and was clutching a stuffed Minnie Mouse doll under her left arm, which they had recently purchased at Disneyland. Since the room was cluttered, it was initially difficult to determine if it had been ransacked or if anything was stolen. Some of the victim's clothing was scattered around the room, and the contents of Patricia's purse were emptied out onto the bed, but since some money and traveler's checks she had been carrying were left behind, it did not appear that robbery was the motive for the crime. Even though Patricia's underwear had been pulled down, the autopsies from the Orange County coroner's office would later reveal that neither she nor Amanda were sexually assaulted. The estimated time for both victims is around 5 a.m. on the morning of the 28th, but no one from the motel reported hearing any gunshots or seeing or hearing anything unusual, leading to speculation that a silencer may have been used or the killer wrapped something around the murder weapon in order to muffle the noise. Since there were no signs of forced entry or struggle, investigators speculated that Patricia may have personally known the killer and let them inside the room, possibly sometime on the evening of March the 27th. The investigation wound up in the hands of the Anaheim Police Department, and detectives would travel to Seattle to explore a number of different leads, which included interviewing some of Patricia's former boyfriends. She had previously been involved in a relationship with a man named Jesse Garza until they made a mutual decision to split up 2 months earlier, but detectives did not consider him to be a suspect. Likewise, Richard Dixon, Patricia's ex-husband and Amanda's father, was also not considered to be a suspect, as he was still stationed with the Coast Guard on the other side of the country in Boston. Patricia's mother, Garnett Stevens, would be interviewed by the Orange County Register newspaper and expressed her belief that her daughter and granddaughter were deliberately trailed to the motel before they were killed, stating, quote, "I don't think any of this is an accident. It's an inside job. I think it was somebody who knew where they were going." End quote. It was reported that a man was apparently seen approaching room 123 around midnight, but it sounds like no one got a good enough look at him for a description to be released. However, Garnett claimed that a witness had given police a description of a man who was seen near the room, and it happened to match the description of a man that Patricia knew, as Garnett said he was a quote-unquote go-between for someone she dated. Garnett did not elaborate on this any further, but she described Patricia as being a responsible mother and found it unlikely that she would have let someone she did not know into her room in the middle of the night. For their part, the Anaheim Police Department would not comment on these allegations made by Garnett, though they confirmed that they did not believe robbery was the motive for the crime. But unfortunately, it seems like all press coverage of this crime came to a complete halt within a few weeks, and I have not seen any further discussion about it from the media or law enforcement. So after 42 years, the murders of Patricia and Amanda Dixon continue to remain unsolved. So I guess you could say the trail went cold. So I first became familiar with this case when a post about it was made at the Unresolved Mysteries subreddit about 7 years ago, and it has over 400 comments, but as far as I can tell, there has been no media coverage of this case since the mid-1980s. And I find it pretty mind-blowing that an unsolved crime like this could completely fade into obscurity, because you're not going to find a more tragic story than a single mother and her 5-year-old daughter being murdered during their dream vacation to Disneyland. And the fact that Amanda was shot to death in bed while clutching a stuffed Minnie Mouse doll she had recently gotten is one of the most heartbreaking details I've ever heard in a criminal case. I definitely wish there was more information available about what happened to Patricia and Amanda, but given that they were killed over 1,100 miles away from their home, you would ordinarily assume that the most logical explanation is that they crossed paths with a stranger who took their lives. However, Judging from interview comments made by Patricia's mother, Garnett Stevens, it appears that she genuinely believed that someone who personally knew Patricia went to the trouble of following her from Seattle to Anaheim in order to commit this crime. Well, when I did a search through the archives at newspapers.com, all coverage of this case seemed to come to a complete halt after 1984, but in the aforementioned Reddit thread, one of the commenters said that they checked the newspaper archives of the Santa Ana Register and found another article from August of 1985 featuring some additional information I haven't seen anywhere else. It was reported that Garnett was in the midst of suing the Anaheim Park Motor Inn and trying to get more information about the case. Apparently, on the night before the victims' bodies were discovered, the motel clerk told Patricia that a man had shown him a message for her on a card which read, quote, "You'll know me when you see me," but the man took this card with him when he left. So, if true, this could confirm that someone did go to the trouble of traveling from Seattle to Anaheim in order to see Patricia. And one more interesting tidbit from this article is that one of the lead detectives on the case revealed that Patricia had been involved in at least 4 different romances with colleagues at her workplace, the Fred Meyer Variety Company. If true, then it sounds like there may have been no shortage of people from Patricia's personal life who could have had a potential motive to kill her, but would they have gone to the trouble of traveling over 1,100 miles to do this, and also murdering a 5-year-old child? Well, we know that Patricia and Amanda arrived at the Anaheim Park Motor Inn on March the 26th, spent the 27th at Disneyland before returning to the motel, and were likely killed sometime during the early morning hours of the 28th before their bodies were discovered later that afternoon. It sounds like this incident involving the man with the card took place on the evening of the 27th, and since the card supposedly contained the message, "You'll know me when you see me," this could suggest that someone who knew Patricia had followed her there. And if she was comfortable enough with this person and did not consider him to be a threat, Patricia may have invited him into her room, which would explain the lack of forced entry. During her interview with the Orange County Register, Garnett claimed that a man who matched the description of someone Patricia knew had been seen near her motel room and used this phrase to describe him, quote, "He was a go-between for someone she dated." At the time, law enforcement would not confirm or deny these allegations, but was this man Garnett was referring to the same guy who showed the card to the motel clerk? Unfortunately, we just don't have that information, but there's a key difference between a man matching someone's description being seen at the motel and a man specifically asking for Patricia there, as Garnett's comments seem to imply that this crime may have been a professional hit orchestrated by someone Patricia dated. While Patricia was found with her underwear pulled down, the autopsy showed that she was not sexually assaulted, a detail which seems to parallel the Pinnacle Lake Murders, since the victims in that case had some of their clothing removed, even though they were not raped either. It also hasn't been reported that Patricia might have had consensual sex with anyone before she was killed, and since she was described as being a responsible mother, I think she would have been reluctant to do this with her 5-year-old daughter in the same room. Perhaps the oddest detail is that a cigarette was found between her legs, though the wording of this from all the sources is a bit ambiguous, as I'm not sure if it just happened to be lying on the floor between her legs, or if it appeared that someone may have been attempting to penetrate her with it. Since no assault was reported, perhaps the killer just decided to pull down Patricia's underwear and leave the cigarette between her legs in order to throw off the investigation and give off the false impression that the crime was sexually motivated. I know that a number of cold cases have been solved in recent years because the perpetrator made the mistake of leaving a cigarette behind at the murder scene, never dreaming that a wonderful little thing called genetic genealogy would eventually link their DNA to the crime decades later. Obviously, the authorities wouldn't have been thinking about DNA profiling back in 1984, but I would be curious to know if they still have this cigarette as evidence, because if it contains traces of the killer's DNA, it could be their best chance to solve the case all these years later. Now, the manner in which Amanda was found suggests that she may have still been asleep at the time she was found. And as odd as this may sound, that might be the best case scenario, since it means that this poor girl didn't have to experience any fear and terror in the moments before she was killed. But anyone who would be willing to shoot a 5-year-old girl in the head like that must have been filled with rage, so what could have driven them to commit this crime? It sounds like this motel was in a rather seedy area, so it would make sense if the crime was a robbery gone wrong. Investigators initially theorized that the perpetrator may have gone down the row of doors with hopes of entering one of the rooms and wound up entering room 123 because Patricia happened to leave the door unlocked. However, even though the contents of Patricia's purse were dumped out on the bed, her money and traveler's checks were left behind, so I really don't think that this crime was financially motivated, and it was likely personal in nature. As far as potential suspects, even though we don't have much information about Patricia's relationship with her ex-husband, Richard, it sounds like he wasn't believed to be a suspect since he was residing in Boston at that time. Of course, that doesn't rule out the possibility of a murder for hire, which is what Garnett seemed to be implying, but she said that the man seen at the motel was a go-between for someone that Patricia had dated and never specifically said the word married, so I don't think that she was suggesting that Richard was behind this. The only other information about Patricia's personal life which was released publicly was that she had apparently made a mutual decision to end her relationship with a man named Jesse Garza 2 months earlier, but he was not considered to be a suspect either. But if Patricia had been romantically involved with no less than 4 separate people from her workplace, then that definitely opens up the potential suspect pool. One article I found featured an interview snippet with Patricia's boss, who said that she was very excited about the Disneyland trip and frequently talked about it at work, and even stopped by the office on the morning of her flight to Anaheim in order to say goodbye to everyone. So it definitely sounds like a lot of people knew she would be there that week. But even so, how many people knew she would be staying at that particular motel? And even though this was back in 1984, I'd like to assume that there would still be a paper trail if someone from Seattle traveled all the way to Anaheim during the time period this crime took place. And once again, even if someone had a personal grudge against Patricia, would they still have been sadistic enough to murder a 5-year-old girl in cold blood? It's been reported that Patricia's travel package to Anaheim was part of a Seattle-based tour group, and even though they made their own individual arrangements to travel there, everyone from the group would stay at the same motel and interact with the others. So an alternate possibility is that during her time there, Patricia became acquainted with someone from this tour group and invited them into her room, but then, for whatever reason, things escalated into murder. I would like to think that investigators already explored this angle, but while it was established that detectives on this case did travel to Seattle to pursue some leads, it's unclear what they might have found and if anyone popped up on the radar as a potential suspect. After all these years, I don't know if this is still an active investigation or if law enforcement has their own ideas about who did this and just lack the evidence to make an arrest. But this is such a tragic and heartbreaking crime that these 2 victims and their family definitely deserve justice. So if you happen to have any information about the murders of Patricia and Amanda Dixon, please contact the Anaheim Police Department at 714-765-1900. That's 714-765-1900. But if you just have your own thoughts about what happened in either of today's featured cases, feel free to leave me a comment or send me an email to robin.warder@icloud.com. That's robin.warder@icloud.com. Now, the reminder that The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so please visit patreon.com/thetrailwentcold to learn how you can support our podcast and become eligible for some pretty neat rewards. Over the past 8 years, our Patreon page has officially released 100 exclusive bonus episodes, which are all currently available on our archives for our patrons in tiers 2 and 3. This past month, we released a bonus episode about a famous kidnapping involving a millionaire heiress, which was featured on Unsolved Mysteries, the 1988 disappearance of Annie Laurie Heron. I've also dropped an exclusive bonus episode from my spin-off podcast, The Pathway in Chile, in which myself and one of my co-hosts, Jules, discuss a case from Unsolved Mysteries involving a missing mother and son, the 1994 disappearances of Cecilia Newpall and Renee Perez. And for our patrons in Tier 3, I've recorded another new audio commentary track, which can be played over a classic episode of Unsolved Mysteries, and we now have over 80 of these commentary tracks in our archives. I'd also like to give a shout out to our most recent listeners who have signed up with us on Patreon this week, and they are Kelly C., SK, Amy L., and Rachel. Thank you all so much for your support. I just wanted to give another shout out to my supporters at the Unsolved Mysteries message board at the Sitcoms Online forum and the Unresolved Mysteries subreddits. I need to provide a big thanks to Miguel Foote, who edits and assembles this podcast together for me, and Vince Nitro, who composed the eerie music you hear on every episode. If you haven't already, you can like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter and Instagram, or leave us a rating or review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, YouTube Music, Podcast Addict, or whatever your favorite podcasting platform is. So have yourselves a great week, and be sure to join us next Wednesday for another brand new episode of The Trail Went Cold.